มีอาจารย์นะคะชาวฟิลิปปินส์ช่วยแปลให้นะคะแล้วก็ถ้าท่านไหนสะดวกจะสอบถามเป็นภาษาอังกฤษให้สอบถามได้เลยนะคะและ
ask in Thai, but from my point of view, I would like you to try to ask in English to be brave because you are the master degree student, you are the doctoral degree student. Try your best. English is not our.
I'm glad to be here. This is Christmas Eve, and this is a present to me to be able to come here and enjoy working with the Thai students and Thai faculty and enjoy Thai food, which I've had plenty of already. My presentation today is on educational technology, tools, culture, and society. And the focus of my presentation is on the future of technology and the future of the tools that we use, but it also focuses on the past in the sense of how we've come to use tools and how we interact with tools. Because although our tools change, the way humans have used tools is similar, and it's very important that we understand that and understand culturally how we use tools. And that's one thing that when I work with my students, it's important to understand. So, as I look in the audience, I see tools come up, and I see you using tools. And that's very good because we are tool users, and we can't be without our tools. So as human beings, we have to have our tools, and we're used to using them for all sorts of purposes. So when I'm somewhere, I'll take a picture of the audience. I feel like I'm here. So it's not important to be here. We have to have a document that we're here. We have to show people that we're here. So in fact, before I'm done, on Facebook, there will be pictures of me speaking. And that's evidence that we were there, and we have to share with people. This is where I am right now. So there's a professor of communications at UNC, at my school, and he's done studies of students and the tools students use, because one of the things he's looked at is how students use smartphones, because one of the things he studies is students in the U.S. In the classroom, the professor will be lecturing and the students will be typing on their smartphones, and they'll be looking at Facebook and doing updates. And the professor will be upset because professors think that what they talk about is the most important thing in the world. So how could anything on here be more important? And he's done studies in terms of why students feel the need to always be connected, to always use their phones. And he talked about one student, so he's done questionnaires. Thank you. He's done questionnaires about this, and he talked about one woman, one girl in his class who, one of his questions is, why during class do you feel the need, to access your phone, to check your phone during class? And one girl, one U.S. student wrote, just because we're in class doesn't mean that the world stops. We need to know what's going on outside because something important may be happening. So it changes the way we think about things, that that we want to be informed, we want to know what's happening. And so at UNC, when I walk through the building, it's very common for me, I'll walk by a classroom and a student will walk out of the classroom and they'll have their phone up to their ear, and I'll hear them say, yeah, I just finished class, I'm walking out of the classroom. Yes, I'm walking to my next class. Okay, I'll talk to you later. And so students are informing each other about very simple things. I left the class, I'm going to another class. To me, I'm a little older, I find that a little strange, but people like to connect socially. They like to keep each other informed. So, but I'm going to talk about how this impacts the way we educate people, the way we do our research. This picture, this is my professional model. She's actually my niece. And so she is a technology user, and she likes all kinds of technologies, and she takes good pictures. So I use her all the time in my presentations. But the way she uses technology is very naturally. To young children, I'm sure if you have children or if you have nieces and nephews, it's not strange to them. You walk into a store and the first thing is children walk up and they don't see it as technology. It's just another object in their world. And so when you're in a restaurant or when you're somewhere and a child is acting up, you hand them the iPhone and they find something to do on it. But I'm going to talk about how we look at the way technology is used. Okay. This is my niece, also one of the writers, especially about digital technologies, is Prensky. And Prensky wrote an article in 2001, and he used terms digital natives and digital immigrants. And he talked about, at that time, people that grew up with technology and people that grew up without technology and learned it later in life. So, for example, a digital native is a child that grew up in the last 10 or 20 years. So some of you in the audience who, since you were very young, there were computers in schools, cell phones, smartphones. Our children today, he called digital natives. So for example, when we talk about English, if you grow up in a home that speaks English, your English skills are going to be very good. You're going to speak as a native speaker. And he talked about digital natives are children that when from the day they were born, they've been in a society that's had access to the internet, access to computer, access to Google. Then there's those in the audience, myself included, When I went to college, we didn't have the internet. The first time I went to college, I went to the library and we looked through cards, actual cards. So we had to learn how to look up our books that way. And we couldn't Google answers. We actually would go through books and we would learn those skills. So when we searched for information, we learned old techniques, but then we found out about the internet. And we later got access to computers. And so we did learn those things, but we learned them in a different way. And this is similar to if you didn't learn English as a child, so you grew up in a home that spoke Thai, and that's your first language, and then you learn English as a second language, you find it difficult. It's not your first language, the sounds are different, the grammar's different. You still can learn it, but it's not your native language. And that was the point that Prensky was making. So, for example, in this picture, this is when my niece was 3. And the story behind this picture is I was having a discussion with her, because even though she was 3, we were having discussions. And it was a Sunday, and I was trying to explain to her that on Sunday we watch American football in our house. We don't watch cartoons on Sunday. She was insistent that we watch cartoons. And so I got my computer and put in a cartoon to play on my computer and showed her that the computer could play cartoons. And she grabbed the computer and realized she didn't know it was a computer, she didn't know what it was, but she saw it was a tool that met her needs. So suddenly she didn't care that we were watching football on TV. She saw that she had a device that could meet her needs and she could watch cartoons on it. So she answered in the word that 3-year-olds, even though their English is limited, she took the computer, looked at it, saw the cartoon, and she said, "Mine," and walked to the chair and sat down, and that was her first day of computer usage. So she sat down with a laptop, and she's loved computers ever since. So, she didn't have a plan. She didn't know everything it could do. She just knew it was a tool that could meet her needs. And so, as a digital native, that's the way that she looked at tools. Now, digital immigrants are individuals that grow up without access to the technology, without access to the training, to the immediacy, but they come later to it. So this is, according to Prensky, they have to adapt. Some adapt well, some adapt not so well. But even when they adapt, they have an accent. So if you learn English as a second language, it's very, very hard. You can learn English. You can learn English very well, but it's extremely hard to sound like a native speaker, no matter how good your English is. You'll always have an accent. you'll always retain your original language. And he says that this is the same with digital, that if you haven't grown up with the technology, that you will always retain that past. And this is true when the technology changes. So for all of us, you know, the technologies are constantly changing, as your dean talked about. So you know, if you're 30 years old, you grew up with more technology than I had, but someone in here who's 20 grew up with different technologies than a 30-year-old. Someone who's 10 years old grew up with different technologies than someone who's 20. So it's constantly changing. And that's one of the challenges for the 21st century, is that you know, when I work with students, you know, my students that are younger think, oh, but I'm on top. I use all the current technologies, and so when I become a professor, you know, I'm going to understand every technology. I'm going to understand the students, and that's how I thought when I was 30. And as I've grown in my career and my experience, I find that as the new technologies come along, I can stay current with the technologies, but I get distant from the culture. And so the younger students have a very different cultural experience than I have. Now, in terms of the digital immigrants, their past experience, their past life, they always retain the old experience. So, for example, this is a screen capture of a Skype session with my father. And my father passed away this past year. He was 92 years old. And before he passed away, I would Skype with him. And he was never comfortable using the computer, so my brother would set up the Skype session. And he never called it a Skype session. He called it talking to Jim on the TV. So he would go to his church and he would say and tell people, he said, I talked to my son on the TV last week. And they would look at him like, what is he talking about? But, you know, that to him, that made sense. And he could use the technology, but he had that accent. He used old terms. And he used to drive my mom crazy because she would have the computer microphone laying. She would lay it down in front of the computer, and he would always pick it up. And during World War II, he was in the Navy, and he would be a radar operator on planes. And so whenever I would talk to him, he'd pick up the microphone and hold it in front of his mouth. And my mom would say, no, you just set it there, it'll pick up your voice. And it didn't matter, he would always pick it up because he remembered, Roger to base, I'm talking to you on the TV. So that was his accent. Whenever he thought microphone, he's like, I know how to use a microphone. I'm going to talk to my son on the TV. I want to do this the right way. So he could use the technology, but he always was thinking his past experience. And so that's an example of a digital immigrant. So when we think about technology use, even in the 21st century, as educators, that we always always have the challenge that our students, are developing their own culture. And we have this challenge that the culture that they develop around technology is going to be newer. And aspects of that culture are going to be positive, and aspects of that culture are going to be negative. And as educators, we're speaking somewhat of a different language. And so it's almost as if, we're speaking Thai and they're speaking English, or we're speaking English, they're speaking Thai. We have to figure out a way to communicate. We need to understand their language. They need to understand our language. Why? Because as educators, we have experience. We have guidance. We have leadership. So we need to understand the technology, but also find ways in which we can translate that and provide them guidance. Now, in terms of using technology, we can look at, we can go back and look at how others have described tool use. And one of the interesting ways we can look at tools is really from the Soviet school or the Russian psychologists. So we look back at, and I'm going to cite two here, Alexander Luria and Lev Vygotsky are two that we often look at in terms of the use of tools. And so these are psychologists that worked, Luria had a long career, but they really did a lot of their work in the 1930s. And it's really interesting because at that time, they, around the 1920s, 1930s, but they were interested in tool use, and they were interested in cognitive development. And they actually did work where they would go to Siberia, and they would go to areas where there was no formal schooling. I would say, I hate to use the word primitive, but go to villages that had no formal schooling, people using primitive technologies, and really talk to them and find out their cognitive development. And so it was really interesting that their theories were based a lot on that type of work. So Luria, one of the things that he talked about is that mental life really depends on complex social practices. So that the tools that we use in society are the product of previous generations, okay, which help shape the mind of the growing child and affect the mental forms. Okay. And this is something that we often lose especially in the U.S. when we think of Western views of technology, because there's a couple misconceptions that are common. One of the misconceptions is that mental development is independent of tool use. And this is something that I think has resulted because society, civilization has existed for so long that we have very little contact with people. I mean, it's very rare, if at all anymore, to find individuals that have no contact with civilization, that have no contact with evolved society. We take it for granted that mental development is something that people are born with, or that people would have without civilization. But one of the things that their work found was that without society, without the work of previous generations, individuals would not have developed the kind of tool use that we see. The other thing that we see in Western thought, and we see this often with technology, is that digital technologies are developed by young geniuses. So Facebook is a young kid in college, that comes up with this billion-dollar idea. And not only that, but he has to drop out of college, in order to follow his dream. So it's a common myth in the United States and in kind of Western thought that the innovators, the creative people, drop out of college. So Bill Gates drops out of college. Mark Zuckerberg drops out of college. Because, hey, all you need is one good idea, and you're going to be a millionaire, a billionaire. And college just holds you back. In order to be successful in the U.S., you go to college long enough to get one idea, and then you go to California, and you find a company that believes in you, and then you get $1 million. For some of us, we spent 20 years in higher education developing hopefully more than one good idea, and we're still working on paying the rent. The reality is that those types of ideas, Facebook and Microsoft and those, they're not a single idea, and they're not, even though young people certainly are very creative and provide a lot of motivation, but it's previous generations that they're built upon society. They're built upon the work of so many others that this is one of the things that President Obama talked about during his campaign, that if a person in the U.S. is an entrepreneur and successfully builds a company, they didn't build it by themselves. So we have an expression, a self-made man. But they built it because the country was strong. There were good roads. There was police to keep people safe. There were schools to educate children. There was a community that provided all sorts of things, and a society that built up and allowed like a fertile field that person could plant their seed in. And so what Lurie is saying here is that, you know, in terms of the tools that human beings use, that tools are evolutions of previous generations, and the culture that in order to come up with a good idea, you exist in a culture. So in terms of language, in terms of the culture that surrounds, you know, your good idea. You may think it comes from, you know, your idea, your head. Your head is filled with the language, the past experience, the information that your teachers have provided you. So, you know, that's really important when we talk about tool use. One of the colleagues and teachers of Lurie was Vygotsky, and he also worked at the same time and unfortunately died much younger in 1934. And when he studied the way children used technology in its pure form, meaning tools. You know, they looked at how children use tools and worked on activities. You know, he said that you know, in the early stages, and again, you know, in the West, we kind of focus on individual development. In the Russian psychologists, focus more on social development. And he said that, you know, when children develop and use tools, that it's not really repetition or discovery in terms of tools. So when you give you know, a child something new, they don't really think to themselves in a very logical sense, you know, I wonder what this toy does. I wonder what the capabilities of this toy are. You know, that's a very adult thought. Okay, you know, an adult would say, "Oh, this is an interesting toy. Maybe I should make a list of the possible things it could do." That what they do is they approach it from a real social environment, and so the child creates a social engagement. In this case, with the experimenter, and so in terms of the practical use of tools, introduces this social aspect. So the tool use becomes very social, and they use the social aspect to get the most out of the tools, and so the child does become or makes use of their language and of their social skills to get the most out of the tool. And that's something that as adults we also do. And you know, we rely heavily on language, even when we are not speaking or not reading. You know, humans are very effective language users. When we are thinking, we think in language. Okay? And you know, we may think visually, we may think with mental models, but those are things we learn in school. So, you know, we may not be verbalizing, we may not be interacting with an individual, but when we talk to ourselves, okay, that's the product of our past schooling, that's the product of our socializing. So we're using language in talking to ourselves, in thinking about problems and how we use our tools. So how does this apply to technologies? When a technology is new, okay, we're not sure how to use it. So, you know, if we were to sit here and say, you know, what tools are we going to use in 2015? Okay. You know, none of us, you know, would do a particularly good job of guessing the future. You know, we might be able to predict a year from now. Okay, okay, we're going to have an iPhone 8. Okay, and it'll be this big, and it just clips on your ear. You know, it's very hard to predict a few years into the future. You know, what devices or gadgets are going to happen. You know, what really happens is that someone creates a device and we are unprepared for it. And some devices, you know, the companies make and no one's interested in it. They're too expensive, or they're too big, or, you know, it doesn't fit a need. But other times, a company will create a device and people adapt. So we get a device and people start using it and their behavior changes. So the progress, you know, is kind of like that child where, you know, the device is out there and people just start using it and they start thinking, well, maybe we could do this, or maybe we could do something else. But people try different things and it changes our behavior, it changes our systems, but it really isn't, especially in the beginning, planned. So when a technology comes out, the adaptation to it is unpredictable. And we can look at this in the past. So for example, motion pictures, when the motion picture was developed, it was a unique, something that was unique, and you know, it was very unclear how it would be used. So people thought, you know, this is going to be terrific for education because, you know, you can show moving images, and this is something that, you know, we haven't had before in education. So you know, people thought of different kinds of things that you could do with motion pictures. So this is an image from the U.S. From a school in New York in 1930, and a teacher said, "Oh, I'll set up a motion picture in my art class," and students I'll show a motion picture of a horse racing, and then the students will try to sketch the moving image. When we look at things today, we can be very distracted about our tool use. And I think archaeologists can also give us insight about how we use various technologies. This is a graph I like to show. My students. Okay, this is a brief overview of Homo sapiens. So this is us. Okay, in terms of the timeline, this shows about 60,000 years ago. This is when it's believed that Homo sapiens left Africa and spread throughout the world. Okay, about 6,000 years ago, over here, around that time is when agriculture was developed. Okay, so from about 6,000 years ago to about the 1800s, okay, this is really our agricultural age. So this is when agriculture was developed in various places around the world. And we have the industrial age, which is about the 1860s to about the 1950s, 1960s. So in that 100 years was when we really developed steam power, fossil fuels, factories, steel, and then we have the information age. So computers, digital technologies, which is really from the 1950s, 1960s to today. So we've really accomplished a lot, but when you look at the scale, what this emphasizes, first of all, what the dean talked about, which is the speed at which our changes are occurring is much greater. So where we switch from being modern, so prior to 60,000 years ago was not modern man. About 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens biologically were very similar to us. So, physically, we're very close to us, but developmentally not. Okay? So from 60,000 to about 6,000, so about 54,000 years. 54,000 years we hunt, we gather, but not much development. Well, I shouldn't say not much development, slow. Okay? So farming, it took a while. Okay? So 50,000 years to move from hunting, gathering to farming. And then farming, as a development. So from 6,000 BC to about 1800, okay, so about 7,000, almost 8,000 years of farming. So quite a while. Then 100 years from using horses to cars and going to space. Okay. And in 100 years, we had gone from using animals, riding horses, to having too much traffic, and having electricity, having power, to unfortunately creating so much power we have pollution. And then from 1950, so in about 60 years, to having no computers, to having a camera, internet, all sorts of computers that you carry around in your hand. So the speed of progress was, has increased dramatically. And not, and the point here I try to make my students is, it's not dramatic that in my lifetime, we went from no computers to the iPhone. That's nothing. This is dramatic. That, we went from thousands of years of agriculture to the industrial age, the information age. So, when we think of an individual lifetime, we think the speed is getting faster. But, someone who was, my dad's age or my grandfather's age, my grandfather could understand culture today. Somebody who lived in the agricultural age would have difficulty understanding culture today. The other thing about this graph is, that's far more important, is at this point, biologically, the brain was very similar to ours. So according to cognitive archaeologists, the Homo sapien brain at this point was very similar to ours. So the question, what they refer to as the sapient paradox, is why did it take so long? Why did it take so long to get to this point, to get to the agricultural age? And the reason they think is society, culture, language. That it wasn't that they didn't have the capability, they didn't have the thought process. It's that they had to develop the culture, the language, that the human beings here had the cognitive capability, but they didn't have the culture. They didn't have the societal framework, okay, that they had later. And that's the reason that we see this development, that society builds on itself. And people build on past generations. And that's why we see that human beings get are so good at increasing their ability to make change, to use technologies, is that we're social animals and that we can improve on the various technologies. So here's a graph of brain capacity, and across the bottom is actual brain volume, and this is millions of years ago, and you can see us right here, Homo sapiens, okay? And actually, we don't have the largest brain capacity. The largest brain capacity is Neanderthals. So that seems a little strange. We certainly have the larger brain capacity of previous forms. But why Neanderthals? They had larger brain capacities. Well, there's a couple explanations, at least in terms of what the experts say. Number one, that the structure of their brain was different. Even though they had larger capacity, structurally it was different. But another one was Neanderthals didn't have the same speech capacity. That physically they were limited in terms of their ability to speak in terms of Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens had the ability to develop speech in a way that was much better. Okay? So going back to Vygotsky, Vygotsky compared the way that children and apes use tools. And here again, we think in terms of how we use technology. That Vygotsky said that when apes use tools, they certainly can use tools. But that when a child uses a tool, they use speech. So through speech, the child's activities is divided into two parts. Okay? So the first part is speech planning. So you use speech to think about what you're going to do. So you think, boy, I'd like to do this. Okay? So you think, I'm going to do this with the toy. I'm planning using my language, using my speech. Okay? And then the second is realizing that, making it happen physically. Okay? And that's something that apes can't do. And so that's the distinguishing factor, so the use of speech. Okay? And again, going back to the cognitive archaeology, okay, according to Renfro, who's a cognitive archaeology, the deliberate and systematic production of tools is the most evident example of engagement process between humans and the material world over the entire course of human story. So, from their point of view, in terms of archaeology, okay, the way that humans produce tools is the most important part of how we can trace human development. So for example, here's an image of arrowheads. Okay? When I look at this image, I think of cell phones. This is Arrow 1, Arrow 2, 2.0, Arrow 4S. And the Arrow 4S is smaller. Yeah, but I like the Arrowhead 4S, but I still have the Arrow 4. I'm going to wait for the Arrow 5. Okay? Just like with cell phones, somebody says, yeah, it's good. I know it's the one my dad uses, but I think it's good. It's the one my dad uses, but I think I can make a better one. I think maybe if it's a little smaller, and maybe we'll make it a little wider at the base. So it's amazing when you look at. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I bought a book just on arrowheads from Pennsylvania. It's incredible, hundreds of different kinds that have been found in different regions used by different groups. And again, it's the individuals thinking, okay, you know, we're going to make a better product. We're going to think about, you know, how, you know, well, we're hunting in the woods, so we're going to have to make it heavier, so it goes through plants and branches when we're hunting, versus we're out in the open, so now it's going to have to be different. It's the same thing we have today, where, oh, we have the iPhone, we have the Galaxy, oh, we could add this, we could take this away. You know, it's the same technology issues we deal with digital. Okay. The other thing Renfro says is it would be a mistake, however, to exaggerate the technological dimension without taking note of the fact that nearly every technological invention, innovation is also social. So we had the Russian psychologists talking about the importance of social in technology. Here we also have the cognitive archaeologists saying the same thing, that technology depends on social. Now this image is one that I like, because this is from Central America, and these are toys that were found in Central America. And the interesting thing about this is these toys, you can see they're like toy dogs, and they have wheels. They're the only wheels found in Central America. They didn't use carts. They didn't use chariots. They didn't use wheels to transport objects. They didn't use wheels to transport themselves. Okay? But they knew of the concept because they were on this toy. So this is an example where, you know, kind of puzzling for archaeologists. This is something where the society had access to a concept, but didn't use it in ways that we think, you know, might be applicable. You know, that's something that, you know, in terms of society, how society chooses to use technology is, you know, is interesting. But again, it becomes a social issue. So, you know, the way that society develops, you know, really does depend on the choices it makes. When I'm back in the U.S., I took my nephew and nieces to a Chinese restaurant. And my youngest niece at the time was 7. And she saw me using chopsticks. She said, I want to try that. So I gave her the chopsticks, and she tried. She said, oh, this is hard. And I said, oh yeah, you have to practice, but if you practice, you can use it. And she said, when you were in Asia, did they use chopsticks? I said, oh yeah, that's what they use. They're very good at it. She's like, oh. She said, but like, did they use it for everything? I said, well, for most things, but not like soup. What do they use for soup? And I said, well, they use a spoon. She said, they use a spoon for soup? And I said, yeah. She goes, so they have spoons? I'm like, yeah. She goes, how can they have a spoon and not a fork? That just doesn't make sense. And to her mind, if you have a spoon